The iron blast doors loomed like a mouth, hungry and wide, rusted with age and secrets. Jack stood there, frozen for a moment, unable to shake the feeling that this wasn't just a place. It was a grave. He hadn't returned to the facility since that fateful day, years ago, when his father vanished without a trace. Jack had been a kid back then, listening wide-eyed to his father's whispered stories about Project Nightmare. His father, a stoic military officer who had always seemed more ghost than man, would pull him close and say, "This place, it holds things men weren't meant to see. You stay away, you hear?" But Jack hadn't stayed away. He couldn't. His whole life had been haunted by his father's absence, by the silence that swallowed their family whole after his disappearance. Now, after years of silence, Jack stood in front of the same facility that had taken his father. His breath was shallow, his pulse quick, but something darker tugged at his thoughts. This wasn't about closure anymore. It was about something more primal, an insatiable need to uncover the truth. Jack had to know, even if it killed him. The tunnel stretched ahead, seemingly endless, its metallic walls reflecting the weak beam of Jack's flashlight. Every step echoed unnervingly loud, the metal under his boots groaning like something alive, as though the very walls were breathing. "God damn it," Jack muttered under his breath, wiping sweat from his brow. His nerves were shot, but he had to press on. With each step deeper into the belly of the facility, the smell of rot became thicker, clinging to his skin. He couldn't help but think of the words his father had whispered late at night, just before he vanished. "There's something down there, Jack. Something that watches." That sickly green glow came into view again, spilling out from behind a door marked restricted access. Jack's flashlight flickered, casting strange, jagged shadows. He paused. His instinct screamed at him to turn back, but something far stronger pushed him forward. That pull, the one that had gnawed at him since childhood, urged him to keep going. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in an unnatural, pulsating green light. Pools of thick, glowing liquid oozed from cracks in the floor, snaking across the ground like rivers of living poison. And there, suspended in the liquid, shapes. Distorted, grotesque shapes. His breath hitched. Jack forced himself to step closer, his mind racing with questions. Were these people? Suddenly, his flashlight sputtered and died, plunging the room into a darkness so thick it felt like it had weight. Jack froze, straining to hear any movement. And then, soft, deliberate, dragging steps echoed through the corridor behind him. "You shouldn't have come here." The sound was unmistakable, claws scraping against metal, deliberate and steady. Jack's throat tightened as he backed away from the pools of liquid, his heart slamming against his chest. Whatever was out there, it was closing in. He could almost feel its breath on his skin, a wet, suffocating heat that made his stomach churn. "Who's there?" His voice sounded thin, fragile, swallowed by the massive, echoing chamber. Silence. And then, the drag of something heavy across the floor. Jack stumbled backward, his hand gripping the dead flashlight like a lifeline. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. His father had warned him, hadn't he? All those nights whispering about things underground, about monsters made by men's greed. The creature lurched into view, crawling out from behind a shattered control console. Its skin was stretched too tight, sickly and translucent, its face devoid of eyes but focused directly on him. Jack's mouth went dry, terror freezing his muscles. It looked human once, he was sure of that. But now, it was something else, something born from the radioactive liquid seeping through the walls. "Holy shit," Jack gasped, his voice barely a whisper as the thing crawled closer, each movement deliberate, calculated. Forcing his body into action, Jack bolted down the nearest corridor, feet pounding against the metal floor. The creature screeched behind him, its claws ripping at the walls as it pursued. His lungs burned, every breath a struggle as he pushed himself faster, barely able to keep his footing in the dark. The tunnels were a twisted labyrinth, each turn more disorienting than the last. Jack's mind screamed for escape, but the walls seemed to close in on him, suffocating, like the facility itself was trying to trap him. The creature was faster. He could hear it gaining on him, hear the rasping of its breath, the metallic screech of its claws. Jack ducked into a side room, slamming the door behind him. The room was small, claustrophobic. Old, broken equipment lay scattered, coated in a thick layer of dust. Jack leaned against the door, breathing heavily, trying to calm the storm of panic raging inside him. Think, damn it. Think. The room was silent, but Jack could feel the presence of something watching him. It wasn't just the creature outside, there was something else. The air was thick with it, like static before a storm. His gaze fell on a series of old documents scattered across a control desk. The yellowed papers bore the official seal of the U.S. military, and in large, bold letters, the project name, Nightmare Protocol. His heart stopped. This was it. This was what his father had hinted at but never told him. With trembling hands, Jack flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the faded text. Experiment to mutate biological specimens, weapons for mass destruction, psychological manipulation, control through fear. The words blurred together, but one sentence stood out, chilling him to the core. Subjects showed signs of heightened aggression, loss of humanity, and complete submission to the facility's control. No survivors. Jack's stomach turned as the truth hit him like a freight train. His father hadn't disappeared. He had been taken by this. By the very experiment he had tried to protect his family from. And now, Jack was part of it. Suddenly, the creature's screech echoed down the hall, louder this time. Closer. Jack's mind raced, adrenaline surging through his veins. He had to get out. But how? The corridors led nowhere, and he was trapped in a decaying nightmare of steel and radiation. Then he saw it, a hatch, barely visible in the shadows behind a rusted console. Without a second thought, Jack yanked it open and descended into the unknown. The ladder was slick with moisture, the air below thick with the stench of rot. Jack's boots hit the ground with a dull thud, and he found himself in a massive underground chamber. The walls were lined with more of those tubes, hundreds of them, filled with that same sickly green liquid. Inside each tube floated bodies. Or at least, what had once been bodies. Twisted, deformed figures hung suspended, their faces frozen in silent screams. Jack swallowed hard, bile rising in his throat. "Dad," his voice broke. As if in response, a figure moved at the far end of the chamber. Jack's heart leapt into his throat as he approached cautiously. It was a man, hunched and gaunt, skin as pale as death. His eyes flickered with recognition. "You shouldn't be here," the man rasped, his voice hollow, barely human. "You can't leave." Jack froze. What are you?" "I was like you," the man said, his voice dripping with sorrow. "Once. But the facility, it feeds on us. On our fear. We're just fuel." The realization hit Jack like a punch to the gut. This place, it wasn't just some forgotten military experiment. It was alive. And it was hungry. The man's hollow eyes locked onto Jack's. "You'll never make it out. No one does." Suddenly, the ground trembled, and Jack spun around. The creatures, were coming. Dozens of them, clawing their way through the tunnels, their screeches piercing the air like the wails of the damned. Jack's heart pounded as the horde closed in. He knew he couldn't outrun them. Not this time. His gaze fell on the largest tube in the chamber, its green liquid pulsating, almost beckoning him. It was a choice. A terrible, awful choice. But he had no other option. With one final breath, Jack lunged toward the tube, smashing the glass with his flashlight. The liquid poured out, thick and cold, covering his skin. He felt it seep into him, twisting, warping, consuming. The creatures stopped. They watched him, their twisted faces filled with a strange reverence. Jack was no longer their prey. He was one of them now. The facility stood silent once more. Above ground, the world continued on, oblivious. And deep below, Jack floated in the green liquid, his veins glowing, his mind lost in the endless, inescapable nightmare. He had found the truth he sought. But at what cost?